Welcome into Words with Wallace. I'm your host, Nick Wallace. Coming at you, it is Sunday, January 26th. And folks, we have an absolutely loaded podcast for you guys today. We have Sean Jones of the Sean Jones NBA Show joining us very shortly here. Had the opportunity to jump on Sean's podcast last week, and so wanted to return the favor here and talk a little bit more about the Phoenix Suns. Sean is a big Suns fan, and I think the Suns are one of the most fascinating teams in the NBA. They've made some moves as of late, still have a ton of star power on that roster, and wanted to get his thoughts as somebody that watches the team a lot closer than I do on where this team's headed, how the season has gone so far, and what they can actually do to still try their best to contend for a title this season. So we're going to be joined by Sean very shortly, but I noticed that all-star rosters are actually going to be released within the next couple of days here. We already had the starting lineups of each conference announced earlier this week, and coming up on Thursday, January 30th on TNT, the full list of all-star reserves are going to be made public, and I think that's where stuff really gets interesting, man. It is so difficult these days to pick all-star rosters. It just feels like there's more talent in the NBA now than ever before, and just going through this exercise of submitting what my all-star ballot would be is really difficult. But I did want to get that out before the public rosters are released. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time giving explanations as to every single player and giving you all their stats. I'm sure you have some idea of how these guys are performing if you listen to this podcast already. But let's go through what we already have in the Eastern Conference with the starting lineup and start there. In the backcourt, we have Jalen Brunson and Donovan Mitchell. And in the front court, we have Jason Tatum, Giannis, and Karl Towns. So honestly, I have no notes on the starting lineup in the East. I'm not surprised any of those guys are starters. And even if I had the opportunity to make changes to that starting lineup, I wouldn't change a thing. I think those five guys are the most deserving. Then for the reserves, how it works, if you guys aren't familiar, there are 7 reserves in each conference. There are 2 backcourt players, 2 guards. There are 3 frontcourt players, and then there are 2 wildcard spots. So with that, in the Eastern Conference, my 2 reserve guards are going to be Damian Lillard and Cade Cunningham. I just think both of those guys have had fantastic seasons, and I think arguably the guard position in the Eastern Conference was the most difficult cuts, but those are the 2 that I ultimately landed on. In the front court in the Eastern Conference for the reserves, I have Jaylen Brown, Evan Mobley, and Pascal Siakam. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anybody that I would have Jaylen Brown on that roster. I think Evan Mobley has had a massive season for the Cleveland Cavaliers, who are obviously top the standings in the East right now. And I think Pascal Siakam's been the best player for the Indiana Pacers all year long. And then finally, I think this is where it's obviously most interesting, the final 2 wildcard spots in the Eastern Conference. A lot of different guys in consideration for these spots, but ultimately, I landed on Trae Young and Tyrese Maxey. I think you could definitely poke holes with Trae, talking about his efficiency and just like the shooting percentages that are down this year, but he is the hub of the Atlanta Hawks offense. I think without him, the Hawks would be a very different team, but ultimately, I think they'd be a worse team offensively. And what he can do on that end of the court is still really special. And so with him averaging 20-something points, nearly 12 assists a game, despite the inefficiency, I still have Trae in that spot. And then Tyrese Maxey, I know the Sixers have been a dumpster fire this year, but felt the need to justify this one a little bit because Maxey has been special. And to be polite about it, the Sixers would be absolutely fucked if it was not for Tyrese Maxey. I mean, that roster is a complete dumpster fire. Obviously, keeping in mind that Joel Embiid and Paul George have barely played in any games this season, I think Tyrese Maxey is the engine that makes them go. He's averaging nearly 28 points per game. He gives you more on the defensive end of the court than a lot of the other guys in this conversation. And so I think the Sixers are ultimately going to tread water and end up making the playoffs, and Tyrese Maxey is going to be the biggest reason as to why. And so that's why I landed on Maxey with that last spot. My first 2 cuts in the East were Darius Garland and Tyler Herro. Garland especially, I think you could really make a strong argument for him over Trae or over Tyrese Maxey. But with having 2 other Cleveland Cavaliers already on the roster, and just keeping in mind that Garland has the best supporting cast of any of those guys, and that's part of the reason why he's so much more efficient than guys like Trae and Maxey. He's had a great season. I just couldn't quite get there. And same thing with Herro. He's been the best player of the Miami Heat. He's had a breakout campaign, but he just missed the cut for me. And then again, more guys that could have made the cut: Bam Adebayo, Jalen Johnson, Zach LaVine, Scotty Barnes. Like, there's just so much talent in the NBA. I had to draw the line somewhere. Now let's move things over to the Western Conference, and what we know so far is the starting lineup, which includes Steph Curry, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and Nikola Jokic. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the most deserving five guys you can think of in the Western Conference. If it were up to me, I think I would give Anthony Edwards a nod over Steph Curry in that backcourt spot. I think I would definitely go with Anthony Davis over LeBron James. If you have to pick a Laker in that spot, I think Anthony Davis is definitely more deserving. And I think you can even make an argument to go Victor Wembanyama over Kevin Durant, but that one I don't have as strong of an opinion on. But nonetheless, all those guys, you knew they were going to make it. You knew they were going to do well with the fan vote. So not super upset those guys are starters. Let's move on to my choices for the reserves. And the first two guards off the bench, I have Anthony Edwards and Devin Booker. I think those two guys are easily the next two most talented guards that aren't in the starting lineup. In the front court reserves in the Western Conference, I have Anthony Davis, just mentioned. I think he actually deserves to be a starter in the West, along with Victor Wembanyama, another no-brainer there with him being the front runner for Defensive Player of the Year and just putting up eye-popping stats, especially after the past couple months here. And the final front court reserve spot, I have Domantas Sabonis. I think his rebounding is a career high at this point in time. He's now shooting the ball at a career high from beyond the arc and has just been the Kings' best player and the hub of a nice little run going on with the Sacramento Kings right now since they made that coaching switch. And then finally, of course, where it gets most interesting, the final two reserve spots in the Western Conference, I'm going with Kyrie Irving and Jalen Williams of the Oklahoma City Thunder. I think Kyrie's had a really slept-on season, and I think he is the main reason that the Mavs have kept the lights on without Luka Doncic for most of the season. I know lately the Mavs have been in a bit of a tailspin, but those first 10 or so games that Luka missed where Kyrie was healthy, he was really impressive. He's had a really efficient season shooting and scoring the ball, and I've just come around on Kyrie a little bit ever since we beat him in the finals. I think that beef between Celtics fans and Kyrie is finally put to the side, and I just really enjoy watching the guy play basketball. I think he's having a deserving all-star season, and Jalen Williams, just what he's doing on both ends of the court for the best team in the Western Conference, the Oklahoma City Thunder. I felt like they probably deserved a second all-star. I don't want it to come down just to that because Jalen Williams has had a fantastic season in his own right, and especially his contributions on the defensive end of the court are really special. So felt good about giving him the nod there. And so that brings us to the snubs in the Western Conference. There's just such a laundry list of guys that you could make arguments for. Ja Morant, I just don't think he played enough games. James Harden, he's had a really solid season for the Clippers. He just hasn't been as efficient as you might want to see. And I think another main reason as to why the team has been so good is also guys like Norm Powell and Zubac, who have their own all-star arguments. So ultimately, I didn't give any of those guys a nod. De'Aaron Fox, obviously an all-star in the past. I just couldn't quite get there with him. And then my two cuts that were most difficult for me personally were Alperen Şengün and Jaren Jackson. And I definitely don't feel great about having no Rockets and no Grizzlies on my Western Conference All-Star teams, especially with how great those teams have been in the regular season so far. But these are both deep rosters that are extremely well coached. And I didn't want to just give one of those guys the nods over somebody else just because I felt like somebody needed to be a representative from that team. And so it was very close. If you want to say Şengün over Sabonis or you want to say Jaren Jackson over Kyrie Irving or something in that vein, I totally hear you, man. This was a really difficult exercise. And so that is all I'll say on my all-star rosters for now, because Sean and I do touch on our most controversial all-star snubs at the end of the podcast episode. And so don't need to spend any more time on that. On my next episode, once the actual full rosters are released, I will go into a little bit further detail about who made it, who didn't, and maybe have a deeper discussion then, as well as the changes with the All-Star Game format, which I haven't even touched. So more All-Star talk to come at the end of this podcast and in future episodes. But for now, let's bring in Sean Jones. All right, coming back here, we have Sean Jones of the Sean Jones NBA Show. Sean, how are we doing today, man?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you doing? Just happy to be on.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Hey, it's conference championship Sunday, but here we are just talking ball. It shows how dedicated we are. So it's good they catch up. As I was saying on my last pod, had the privilege of joining you on your show last week. So glad we were able to do this, and interested to hear what you have to say about your Phoenix Suns here in a little bit.
For sure. Yeah, it was definitely a blast recording last week. So obviously wanted to come on, return the favor. I'm always happy to talk Suns or really anything NBA. So excited for it.
Perfect, man. Well, just to set the scene for our listeners who might not be as familiar with the Phoenix Suns, or at least how they're doing this season. Right now, the Suns are in an okay spot, maybe better than what they were a couple weeks ago. Record on the season is 23-21. They are 7-3 in their last 10 games, so not a bad stretch here, but that leaves them at the 8th seed in the Western Conference, right between Minnesota and Dallas. And so just to kick things off, because I know a lot of my listeners are on the East Coast, so they probably don't have as much of an opportunity to watch the Phoenix Suns. How is the season going for you? How are the vibes in Phoenix right about now?
Yeah, I mean, the vibes could certainly be better. It's been really a roller coaster season. I mean, They got off to an 8-1 start, and hard not to be excited about that, except a lot of those games were very close. They were winning in crunch time. KD was just going ridiculous at the end of games, but they really struggled once they started to get some injuries. I think Durant got hurt after that ninth game that they had and missed a little bit of time there. And then they went 7-16 in the next 23. And then, as you mentioned, they have gone 8-3 in their last 11, but they have had a little bit of a lighter schedule recently. But it's really hard to gauge this team, because just looking at like the fan base and how they feel from what I've seen on social media and just my personal thoughts, you really can look at it in one of two ways. On one hand, they are actually 21-8 when both Booker and Durant play. So of course you can look at that and say like, okay, that's nearly 60 win pace. When we've been healthy, it's been a good year overall. But obviously that means they are 2-13 when one of them misses a game. So they haven't been able to sustain any sort of level of success when they're missing one of those guys. And coincidentally enough, they're actually 8-0 in games when Booker and Durant play and Beal does not play. So the Beal factor has been a little interesting this year as well in terms of how he has fit into the team. Obviously, they moved him to the bench recently in favor of Ryan Dunn. And that has actually perfectly coincides with their last 11 games in the stretch. They've gone 8-3. That is the cutoff there is when Beal moved to the bench. So positive returns on that so far, but it's just been inconsistent, as obviously we've seen. I mean, they're 18th in net rating with a -0.9 on the season. They're 23rd in defensive rating. They get even worse in the half court. They're 27th in half court defensive rating. They're only ahead of Utah, Brooklyn, and Washington, which is not a good group to be with.
To say the least, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's really hard to gauge. Like I said, on one hand, you can look at the positives. On the other hand, they are 2 games above 500, and we're almost into February. I think they are fortunate that the West is so compact. They're only 2.5 games out of the 5 seed, which is ridiculous. I mean, they go on a 5-game winning streak. Suddenly they might vault up to that 5 spot. But conversely, you go on a 4-game losing streak and you might find yourself in the 12th seed. So it's kind of a wait and see. Obviously, there's been a lot of rumors surrounding the team about some potential moves that might get made. And so I'm withholding too much judgment until we know what the final product looks like. But hard not to be a little bit disappointed just based on where they are in the standings right now.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason I was so excited to have you on is I think the Suns are so fascinating with the way that they are dealing with the repercussions of going all in and the moves that they've made the past couple seasons, where like if you look at this season in a vacuum, I don't know how you can be too one way or the other, too high or too low. Like what were really the expectations based on what we knew that they had going into this season, and at the same time, still feel like they are in a decent spot, all things considered, because like you said, the West is really compact, but for them to be playing below maybe their standards and certainly below their ceiling, and they're still pretty comfortably in a playoff spot here, or at least a play-in spot, that's not too bad. And so, when I look at the roster, I still feel really good about guys like Kevin Durant, Devin Booker. I don't think you can just point to those guys and be like, hey, they're not playing to the level that we expect. And so just taking a deeper look at the rest of the roster, clearly something is not gelling there. And obviously the front office is working to make some moves recently that we're going to hit on in a second. But based on the guys that have been playing this year, do you have we're halfway through the season, do we have like a mid-season award of who, as a Suns fan, has impressed you the most and who also has been the most disappointing Phoenix Suns so far?
Yeah, I think on the impressive side, I'd have to go with Ryan Dunn, the rookie that we took with, I believe, the 28th overall pick in this past year's draft. As a contributor to the Valley of the Suns, which is the fan-sided Suns dedicated site that they have, I actually wrote a pretty extended piece saying that he was kind of the X factor for them this year. The one thing on paper that they might have been lacking in coming into the season, or at least one of the things, was a clear defensive presence on the perimeter, a guy who can be the point of attack guy to guard some of the tougher guards or wings in the West and really across the whole NBA. And Ryan Dunn, for the most part, has stepped up and done just that. I mean, he's definitely been by far the best defensive player on the perimeter for the team. Like I mentioned, they're 8-3 since he was inserted into the starting lineup, which in that same span is a better record than the Celtics, than the Cavs, than the Thunder. So they've looked good overall since he's been in the lineup. And he's been able to take on the best offensive player on a night-to-night basis, which has taken a ton of pressure off of the Beals and Bookers and Durants of the world. And I have no doubt that he can down the road be an all-defensive type player at some point. But he's also really impressed me on the offensive end to this point. I know the shot was of much conversation coming into the season just because of how non-existent it was in college, and then coming into the summer league and preseason, it was suddenly looking much improved. And so he is still shooting only 32% from three on this season, but he's been a willing shooter, which is really all I can ask for. He shoots with confidence. He's got no hesitation. He's shooting 35% on corner threes, which again, not spectacular, but good enough. It's respectable.
Serviceable.
Teams have to. Yeah, teams have to guard him out there to a certain extent. And it's not been so bad where it's like, oh my God, they're not even guarding him like Andre Roberson style back in the day. But he's also a really good off-ball cutter. He knows where to be and knows when to fill the lanes. I've been pretty impressed with him as like a finisher as well. He's shooting 75% at the rim this season, which is better than I would have thought, just given that he's not really known for having great shooting touch. And he's actually shown some pretty good flashes in like the floater, short, mid-range lane of the court as well. He's shooting 51% on short, mid-range shots, according to Cleaning the Glass. So, he's been better than I think anyone could have hoped offensively, and he's for the most part lived up to the defensive reputation that was followed him coming out of college. So in terms of most impressive, I mean, I am a big proponent of like play this guy 35 minutes a game, like play him until Tibbs style, like till he can't play anymore, because when he's out there, good things typically happen, especially on the defensive end.
100%. And I think that's a great cut. I mean, I certainly have not watched the Suns as much as you, but that question I just asked you, Ryan Dunn, was the answer for me as well. It's just huge. I think longer term as well, looking at this roster to just preserve Kevin Durant and what you're asking that guy to do on a night-to-night basis. And again, we'll talk about the move to acquire Nick Richards here in a second, but I think between that move and bringing in a guy like Ryan Dunn, who can take that top defensive assignment night in, night out, you have to feel better about the longer-term health of Kevin Durant when you're just asking him to do a little bit less on that end of the court, especially compared to what he had to do last season. And so moving on, the second part of that question, just curious, again, this team has fallen short of expectations. Is there any guy that's just been frustrating for you night in, night out, watching this team that's been disappointing?
Yeah, I mean, there could be a couple answers for this. The very easy one is Jusuf Nurkic. I mean, he's been just a total shell of what he's been, not only in his career, but even last season. We talked about this on my pod. Like, he was pretty good last year. Like, anyone who thinks like, oh, he's just been this totally washed, unplayable guy over the last few years, like, that's not really true. But this year, he's totally fallen off a cliff and has lived up to that label of completely unplayable. I mean, Bud has completely removed him from the rotation altogether. He's the fourth center on the depth chart now with Nick Richards in the fold. And like, honestly, respect to Bud, because it needed to happen. We have been begging for him to be not only not starting, but getting less minutes for a while. And just, I mean, they're a -6 when he's on the court, a +1 when he's off. He's got more turnovers than assists on the year. But the problem with that, too, is that his usage rate is a lot higher than a lot of all the other centers that kind of grade out in the same range in terms of assist to turnover ratio. So he hasn't really picked up that, like, dude, we kind of just need you to be a role player. He's sloppy with the ball. He tries to do a little bit too much offensively a lot of the time. And he's not efficient. He's one of the worst finishing bigs in the league. And defensively, he doesn't bring above average rim protection. He's not versatile on that end. And it's really difficult in today's NBA to get big minutes as a center if you don't space the floor, you don't protect the rim, and you don't have defensive versatility. And he really doesn't bring any of those things. So
100, and you're seeing why, right? And it's like, I think there was actually a quote that came out, and you would probably know this better than me, but I think I saw it came out yesterday where he said Nurkic said he doesn't even have a relationship with Coach Bud, which is like, yeah, great. Glad things are in an awesome spot. Which tracks based on the minutes that we've seen. And it's kind of funny because he definitely has a unique skill set that, again, not many other bigs in the league do, but he almost doesn't do any of the things well that you need from a center, right? For this team, right? When you already have some really skilled creators and shooters and scorers on the rest of the roster, it's like, hey, we need a big body that's going to run the floor and finish at the rim and protect the ball and rebound. And it's like, he kind of falls short in all those areas. Like, even though he's a great passer, even though you can kind of run some offense through him, you just don't really need that from Nurkic. So on that note, they've definitely done some things to address what I would argue has definitely their weakest spot is their front court rotation. All starts with the move to acquire Nick Richards, which took place about a week and a half ago at this point. And just to catch up some listeners that might not be aware of what that move looked like, they traded with the Charlotte Hornets, acquired Nick Richards. In return, they sent away Josh Okogie, and they sent away like a couple second-round picks. The net of it was, I think Phoenix ended up losing like 1 or 2 second-round picks in that deal. But the moral of the story, they swap out Josh Okogie, they bring in Nick Richards. And this move, again, really small sample size. It's got to be like less than 5 games at this point. But tell me what your reaction was when that trade took place, and then more importantly, what are the early returns on that deal so far?
Yeah, in terms of like my initial thoughts, we talked about it on my pod, but like it's a low risk move. I mean, Okogie was really only getting part-time minutes in the rotation, depending on if like a guy was missing that night due to injury or something like that, just not consistently in the rotation. And so he was expendable, especially when you've got Ryan Dunn, who's bigger and younger and more of a long-term piece, kind of filling a lot of the role that Okogie was brought in to do. And then the second round picks, I mean, like you mentioned, I think we gave out 3, brought 1 back in. So in net, we were giving out 2 second round picks, which for a not only rotation piece, but now our far and away best center on the roster starting 5, I'll give up 2 second round picks all day. So of course it was like it's a low risk move. We know what Nick Richards is. He's not going to be asked to do anything that's outside of his skill set. So I was a fan of the move overall, regardless of what else they do with the roster. He's also under contract for next year. He's very cheap, only $5 million a year. So there's not a lot of downside to bring him in. But in terms of what I've seen out of him so far, I mean, he's been great. If we're being honest, he's played 4 games last night against the Wizards. He was 1 rebound short of a 2020 game, which was pretty funny. There was the last 3 like missed shots the Wizards had in the game. Other players were like trying to avoid getting the rebound, but he just like couldn't get it for some reason.
I actually watched the fourth quarter of that game just in preparation for this podcast. And they killed me when one of the rebounds was like a wedgie.
Hit him in the face. Also, there was one that hit him in the face.
That he had and like the one that was a wedgie, he just looked so disappointed. Like all the announcers were talking about it, but we did mention again that was the Washington Wizards, who are just like an outlier. So like you almost have to throw those out the window. But again, like eye test wise, you can't get mad at a guy coming in the building and doing what you asked him to do, right?
Totally. Yeah. And like he's averaging 13 and 12. He's shooting 68% so far. He's done a really good job of getting to the foul line, which is something that the other big men on this roster have not done a good job of. And he's actually a pretty respectable shooter from there. He's above 70% on the season. So, but yeah, in 107 minutes, they're a plus 11.4 with him on the court. 121 offensive rating, 110 defensive rating. So it's really hard to be mad about anything that he's done so far. I mean, he's been a great rebounder. Hasn't really gotten a ton of blocks, but he's still just more of a presence down there than some of the other guys that we've got on the roster, most notably Plumlee and Iguodaro, who's a good young player, but more offensive minded than defensive minded at this point in his career. And yeah, he's a rim runner. He's a lob threat, which is something they just have not had. There was actually a play last night where Booker drove in and Richards was in the dunker spot. And right as Booker like put 2 hands on the ball, Richards took steps towards the basket to like go up and catch a lob, but Booker was like doing a dump off to him, and so it was a turnover out of bounds. And Richards was like, "Dude, throw it up! Like, what are you doing?" And it's like,
I'm sorry, I'm not used to it. Yeah,
no, that's what I'm saying. And you can see Booker's like, "Oh, right." So that's what it's like to have someone who can actually catch a lob and finish over somebody. So they're still working through the kinks there. He obviously did have a big stinker game against Cleveland. I think he had like 4 points, 4 rebounds, or something like that. But you know, Cleveland's kind of been kicking everybody's ass this year, so it's hard to put too much into that, especially for a guy was in his 2nd or 3rd game with the team. So I bet hard not to be happy with Richards to this point, but obviously he doesn't solve all of the problems that they have.
Totally, and I do think again, like it can end up being for. You know, we're already spending a lot of time talking about the move to acquire that a guy who was previously a backup center on a well under 500 team. Yeah. But again, he's a guy that he's been in trade rumors the last couple of years. He was a guy I wanted the Celtics to actually pick up at the deadline last year when we had a need for an extra front court spot. We settled on Xavier Tillman instead. But that being said, like it's when you're looking at a team as talented as Phoenix, like there has to be something that can be done around the margins where even a slight upgrade at one of these spots or a guy that brings a slightly different skill set to what you have can be the thing that unlocks the team because you already have two guys that you know can be two of the best players on a contending team. And so with that in mind, I think we covered Nick Richards pretty well here. I think the more interesting move for Phoenix is the one that came, earlier this week, I guess, in which they swapped some draft capital with the Utah Jazz. And the spark notes of that is they gave away, their 2031 unprotected first round pick in return for 3 different first round picks from Utah that are all the lesser of pick swaps. So most likely you're going to look at a first round pick that's somewhere between 23 and 30, basically all 3 of those years. But it certainly adds a lot more flexibility for the Suns moving forward. And I just wanted to get your opinion on, again, that trade when it happened, and what do you think is to come now that Phoenix has made that move to acquire some more firsts?
Yeah, it really was an interesting deal. It's not often you see one first dealt for 3 firsts, and I totally understand Utah's thought process behind it. Like those picks, especially the one this year, it's like Cleveland's got the best record in the NBA. It's probably going to be at best, the 29th pick in the draft this year. So about as low value of a first you could possibly have. And then the other ones in 27 and 29, obviously you can't really project 4 years away. Like you never know what could happen with Cleveland, Minnesota, Utah, whatever. But those picks probably are going to be in the 20s, as you mentioned. So I understand from Utah's perspective. From Phoenix's perspective, it's kind of like hard to give them a grade yet because you kind of want to see what they do next because it screams like a precursor move where they had something up their sleeve. They were talking to other teams, and of course the Jimmy Butler rumors are swirling, and the idea is that Beal has to go to a third team, Butler to Phoenix, and Miami wants other salaries. But in theory, you'd be like, well, Miami probably wants a pick or two to get rid of Butler for more lesser pieces. Whoever's taking Beal probably wants a first as well, just to take on that contract. But they've got the super valuable 2031 pick, but they can't break it up, obviously. So it's like, who gets that pick? And that's why the deal was stalling or becoming more difficult before this trade they made with Utah. But it really just depends, like I said, on what they do next. But at least it gives them more options. It gives them flexibility. I totally get it. They now have a first round pick in all of the next 6 drafts. So even if they decide to not necessarily make some big move and trade all 3 of them, they're at least set up to say okay, now we can. They've drafted pretty well recently. Ryan Dunn was late first round pick. Oso Ighodaro has shown flashes as a second rounder. The year before, they drafted Toumani Camara at the 52nd overall pick, who was a throw-in at the time of the trade. And me and many other people are having lots of regrets about that.
I didn't mean to totally derail us, but one thing I almost wanted to ask you about, I'm like, do you guys kind of regret that move at all, or that part of it? Because he was such an afterthought. That whole trade is a disaster.
I mean, yeah. I think people want to pinpoint the Beal trade as this trade that set the team back. I totally disagree. I think it is that move because Nurkic has been awful. Grayson Allen's been about as good as you probably could have hoped, but
very true.
He's got such a ceiling on him, and not to say that shooters are a dime a dozen, but his skill set is replicable elsewhere. But having Dunn and Kamara on this team alongside Booker and Durant just sounds like such a better defensive infrastructure. I mentioned defense has really been their biggest issue this year, and that solves a lot of the issues. Ayton, obviously, Portland fans have started to turn on him as Phoenix fans did. But I mean, he's still better than Nurkic. He can dunk the ball and he can guard a little bit on the perimeter. It's just more about inconsistencies with him. So that deal was. Don't even get me started on that one. But
I'm so aligned, and it's obviously easy to say now that it seems like our initial opinions on those deals were both correct. But I was in the moment, it's I get it. Ayton was no longer an asset. You couldn't even get a watered down Ayton. You just got a totally different type of big, and we're seeing the effects with Nurkic. Yeah. But for those that don't know about Kamara, he's been a starter in Portland who is sneaky on a nice little run here. They've rattled off 3 in a row, and he's just seems to have a ton of defensive upside. He's their point of attack defender and can hit shots at a decent clip, and so he looks like he's doing all right in Portland. You have to imagine if you put him next to some star players, he would shine a little bit more in Phoenix as well. So
exactly, and so that's what I'm saying is they've drafted pretty well with the lesser picks they've had in recent years. I mean, since James Jones took over, Jalen Smith was probably a miss at 10, especially when you consider the fact that Halliburton was 2 picks later. But even Cam Johnson the year before that people thought that was a reach and that was a bad pick at 11. They could have maybe traded back into the late teens, early 20s to scoop him up. But people are talking about him going for 2 first-round picks right now, and he's having a career year. So that ended up being a good pick. So they've drafted pretty well with this regime overall. So even if they keep these picks, it at least gives them like some chances to find some cheap contributing players, which is what you need when you've got 3 max players on the same team. It creates a lot more options. So we will see what they do with those picks. I would be shocked if at least 1 or 2 of them isn't traded at the deadline, but it gives them flexibility.
Yeah, 100%. I'm glad we kind of put all that together and laid it out like that, because James Jones really has been crushing it, and even some of the questionable moves from the Suns, you just have to wonder, like, again, the Ayton relationship being unrepairable at that point in time, or like how much of it is Ishbia with the new owner syndrome and him being like, go get Kevin Durant right now. Like, that felt like a move that might have even been outside of James Jones's control, but he's been crushing it with those picks. And so with that in mind, and alluding to what they might do with these picks, like, you've had a little bit of time to mull this over with like the past week or so since they've made that move. Do you have like a dream trade in mind to quote unquote fix the Suns? Do you have anything if James Jones approached you where you'd be like, this is the move?
Well, I'll ask you this. You want me to start with the Jimmy Butler possibilities or go to another move first? Because I do have another move I think that I'd like them to make. Whether they get Butler or not, I think it would be useful for them.
Let's start with Jimmy. That's a good point, because I had that marked as well. Like, we have to do a fake Jimmy trade at this point, because it seems like the writing is on the wall, or at least it's moving in that direction. If I really had to pick a team, it seems like Phoenix is probably the betting favorite. So give me your Jimmy deal, and then we'll move on to the other one.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the exact framework, it's impossible to know, because I mean, they're talking about 4-team, 5-team, could even be 6 or so. Like, who knows? I think that's why it's taking so long, because there's a reason we don't see trades this big among this many teams very often. I can't even really think. The one that comes to mind for me was the old Dwight Howard trade a long time ago, with like Iguodala went to the Nuggets and Dwight goes to the Lakers, and then Vucevic from the Sixers to the Magic, blah, blah, blah. But like, I'm sure there's been a couple other ones since then, but it doesn't happen often. And so the exact framework is still up in the air, but it seems like Butler to Phoenix, Beal to some third team, whether it be Milwaukee, but then there was the report maybe they're not interested. Chicago's been mentioned in a deal where maybe Levine then goes to Milwaukee, whatever it might be. But it does seem like Phoenix at least is in the driver's seat for this. But I am very on board for this trade, honestly, because this front office has made it abundantly clear that they do not intend to break this core up, at least not in the immediate future. And so if you're going to ride it out, then you got to continue to try to put them in a better position to contend. And I think Jimmy genuinely does bring a lot to this team. And aside from what he brings, just getting off the Beal deal in itself is a huge plus. If you can upgrade the roster while getting off of Beal's contract, I mean, I think that's kind of a no-brainer at this point. I mean, he's owed $110 million over the next 2 seasons, $50 million this year. So there's a reason that teams are asking for another asset just to take him on. But Butler, for this roster, I think he brings diversity offensively. The Phoenix Suns are a team that is dead last in the NBA in percentage of shots taken at the rim. And Jimmy Butler this season is the number 1 player in the entire NBA in percentage of shots taken at the rim. And since he got to Miami, he's been 98th percentile or higher for his position. So just bringing that downhill, attacking offensively, creating rim pressure. We just talked about it with Richards. They haven't had any sort of rim pressure, whether it be from bigs or from perimeter players getting downhill to the basket. And he also is a master at getting the free throw line. He's been number 1 in the NBA at his position as well for drawing fouls. So like that's his forte. And that's something they really struggle at. And so obviously he's a little bit of a trade-off with shooting there, but I think because of the just ability to get into the paint and score from there, I think that can kind of make up for some of those shortcomings there. Additionally, he brings size and perimeter defense. He's like 6'7", 6'8", And if you look at the Suns rotation, if you just take the centers out of the picture, because obviously they're all bigger and playing the 5 spot, but the rest of the roster, it's KD and Dunn that are perimeter guys with size. If you look at everybody else in the rotation, Beal is 6'4", Grayson Allen is 6'4", Royce O'Neal is 6'4", Tyus Jones 6'1", Monte Morris 6'2", and then you got Booker who's like 6'5", 6'6", but obviously he's not like going to be guarding the bigger perimeter wings for this team. So they're massively undersized. And I think that's why they're 2-13 when Durant and Booker, one of them doesn't play, because Durant has missed the majority of those games. And they are playing Royce O'Neal at power forward, like at a 6'4". It's just not viable in the NBA today, especially as it's moving towards more size, and that's becoming more prevalent. So I think he can be the point of attack defender, whether it be him or Ryan Dunn. But I think also him being more of a third option. And he publicly came out, or there was some quote that came out that said he's willing to be third fiddle to those two guys, but not Hero and Bam, which is somewhat understandable. But I think he is going to be able to put more energy and effort into defense. He's still a good defensive player, but obviously it's harder once you get older and you have to have more offensive load. He's probably going to be the freshest he's been in a long time because he hasn't been playing games. I mean, he's just been sitting at home healthy, like, you know what I mean? So I expect him to be motivated and ready to contribute wherever they need. And I think he brings toughness. It might sound ironic right now, given the whole situation in Miami, but I do think he's a very good vocal leader when he wants to be. And I think he just has some of that, like, give a crap mentality, you know what I mean? Which I think this team lacks. And so I think it checks a lot of boxes across the board. And I think that them being boxed in with their assets kind of helps to an extent, because they can't get like fleeced into like, all right, we'll throw Ryan Dunn in there. It's like, well, we literally can't by the CBA. Throw Oso in there. We literally can't. Like, give us 5 picks. We literally don't have 5 picks. So, you know, there's a clear ceiling on what they're going to have to give. And as long as that's what they're giving, then to me, it's a no-brainer trade.
Yep. Wow. I think, first of all, you sold me a little bit there, because I think at first I was a bit skeptical with just how much of a needle mover he would be. And I did rank like my top destinations for Jimmy, and I think I had Phoenix at like 3 or 4, just because I think there's other teams in the conference that are more in need of what Jimmy brings to the table than Phoenix. Like, I don't think Jimmy's like necessarily a catch-all for fixing all of their issues, but the different question is like, hey, is he an upgrade over Bradley Beal? Like, that answer is a surefire yes for what that team needs. And even concerns about like the outside shooting and the drop off there, like, you have enough perimeter shooters that could then be off the bench, like whether that's a guy like Tyus Jones, whether that's Grayson Allen, that depending on the matchup, like they might get the nod alongside Jimmy Butler if he can be that point of attack defender, and then you move Ryan Dunn to the bench like we were saying. So I like that move a lot. And so just to put a bow on it, have you put the thought into, like, obviously Beal is in that deal. Like, is the question for you, like, I guess, how many firsts of those ones that you just acquired from Utah, or maybe the other ones that you have available, how many are you willing to give in the deal with Bradley Beal? Like, asking your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think they'd be smart to try to hold on to one of them. Just whether that be just to hold on, like I mentioned, to use it down the road, or to keep it in the back pocket to maybe offload Nurkic or make another addition or something like that. But ultimately, I do think it's going to probably take all 3, just because of how many moving parts this trade has. And ultimately, Phoenix, I mean, it's been reported that they are the most aggressive team. They're the most motivated team to make this happen. And if you have your back against the wall with no other options, and you're the most highly motivated team, you're probably going to be the team that has to throw in the sweetener to convince somebody. You know what I mean? If you look at a Chicago, it's like, sure, we could do this, but why are we doing this? Like,
and it's probably like the 2 first to get Butler, and then that 3rd first to get off of Beal, right? It's kind of where the math goes. Like, do you agree with that logic of it?
Yeah. But I could see the other way around, honestly, if they got to do 2 for Beal, and then depending on what goes back to Miami, you know, because if you look at their situation, like, are they going to do better than a first with some expirings with another team? I don't know. I don't know if there's another team out there offering a first for him right now, just given the whole situation. So they might not even need to do 2 to Miami, and if the other teams are all in agreement, and that's the best offer they got, and we're a day before the trade deadline, they might just be like, you know what, fine, cut our losses, it's a deal. So you never know.
And the reality is that's still probably a win for Miami because, like, what are you going to do? Keep suspending him and then just have him
Yeah.
walk for nothing? Like, you'll still take the
Hmm.
crappy firsts that you can get. And just to
Yeah.
remind everybody, like, these are, again, like, as low value firsts as possible given the pick
Yeah.
swaps and the teams that they're coming from. I saw the meme that it was like a pizza party, and it was like the slices of pizza
Yeah,
that
I
the
saw
Suns
that
are
too.
now giving out, and it's like they're this big. And so, anyways, it's just
Yeah.
that's kind of what the Suns are working with. So,
I
go ahead.
will also add though, but because they now have picks over the next 6 drafts, they don't necessarily have to trade the ones they acquired.
Yes.
The 26 pick is now tradable. The 28 pick is now tradable. They can't trade the 30 because they don't have a 31st right now because the Stepien rule, but it unlocked the ability to say, so like the
Yes.
26 pick is, I think, it's a swap with like Washington or Phoenix. And I'm like, that could be a valuable pick. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? So
totally.
that might be able to entice someone. So they have more options because of everything we laid out. But
Perfect. That's good to know as well. Great stuff on that. So
yeah.
I think I guess I'll hear you out on the other move you had in mind.
Yeah.
Just if there was a non Jimmy Butler move for the Suns.
I would be a huge fan of making this deal even if we don't get Butler, because I still think it just solves, I won't say solves a lot of their problems, but it helps with some of the issues they've had this year. And I would be very on board with going after a guy like Robert Williams from Portland. And I don't think it would take more than a first. I mean, he's been just a huge health concern and liability since leaving Boston, even when he was in Boston, honestly. I mean, it was just so fitting. He like got a season-ending injury, I think, in his second game as a Trailblazer last year. And he's been ramping up coming into this year. But I still like his upside. I think, I mean, it's not that long ago where he was at least in the discussion for like Defensive Player of the Year, 2-3 years ago at this point.
Yeah. Yep.
And an all defensive level player. He's a lob threat, as we mentioned. He's going to play in his role offensively, and he's most importantly a rim protector, which Phoenix hasn't had any of this year. Richards provides some of that, but I think Williams is even an upgrade there. And so it would be sort of replicating a little bit of what Dallas did last year with the Lively and Gafford pairing. I think Lively and Gafford are a better duo, but it's sort of like a poor man's version of that, where it's like, okay, now we've got 48 minutes of somebody on the court who is big, who protects the rim, who's a rim runner, who's a lob threat, who's not going to do stupid stuff out on the court. And so to me, if they could just like cut out the Mason Plumlee minutes, save Oso for more situational minutes on the court, and just roll with those two. And this has been a guy that's been talked about for a lot of teams. And even for Phoenix, I had thought about it, but I was like, do we really want to trade like our starting center at the time, Nurkic, for him? And then like, what if then he's hurt? Then we're like just Plumlee and Oso. But because we have Richards now, I feel way better about the move, because it's at that point, he's more of just a luxury, you know? And so in terms of players we could send out Nurkic in a first. I don't know if Portland would do that, because I think it sounds like Nurkic, you got to attach something just to offload him. So maybe it's Grayson Allen. I think that is a sacrifice I might be willing to make, because, I mean, he's shooting like 43% from three this year, and he's been great. He led the NBA in three-point shooting last year, one of the best shooters in the league. But especially if we're keeping Beal, then he becomes a little redundant, where it's like, how many shooting guards can you really put in your rotation at one time?
Totally.
So I'd love to see that mood, whether they get Jimmy or not. They may not even have the pick for it if they do the Jimmy deal. But either way, I think just going from the center position being probably the worst rotation at the 5 in the entire league and a huge weakness, to suddenly like, wow, now you get two guys who are both more than competent and bring a lot of what the team needs, I think is a huge plus.
No, I love that. Obviously, that as a Celtics fan there, that hits on something I've known for a long time. We love Rob Williams. You know, it's just a matter of his health, right? Like, that's what it is. But like you said, your chips have been in the middle of the table for a couple straight seasons now. Like, that's very on brand. And I don't think the price to get Rob Williams, like, I can't imagine it's too much. Now, I think Portland is still, like, obviously you're going to play him more than what Portland's playing him right now. Like, they're really like, hey.
He's not been getting minutes.
No, not at all. And it's like they're giving him just enough to like flash. Like, he put down a stupid
They're like,
lob
don't
the
get
other
hurt.
day.
Put a Band-Aid on him.
Yes, yeah. And it's like, I saw them after they played the Rockets the other night, and like Ime is like pulling him to the side. They're talking for a while. I'm like, I'd be shocked if the Rockets don't put in an offer to get him and upgrade the backup big spot as well. So either way, he's definitely still a desirable asset, and I think that's like the perfect swing depending on the price. So I really like that as well. And like you're saying too, like having guys like Oso, like, hey, if you have Rob Williams as one of your two bigs, you still need a third big. So even he's going to get his developmental minutes still. He can learn behind those guys. So I really like that. I like that move. So we'll definitely stay tuned and keep our pulse on the Suns the next couple of weeks. Because again, like you, I would be shocked if they're not making at least one more move before the deadline. Maybe it's Jimmy Butler. Maybe it's a different move that you described. But it's difficult to predict on where the Suns are going until after the deadline. But since we have you here today, I did just want to at least go through the exercise because I just did my whole tier ranking last episode where, putting apart the contenders and everything like that. I had the Suns in like the one piece away tier. I feel like that might even be a little generous if you look at the Suns record, to be honest with you. But I think we've covered why the team has so much upside. But I want to ask you, how many teams in the Western Conference would you put above Phoenix as far as ranking the teams that actually have a shot to win the title this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether they make the Butler deal or not, I don't see them having really any chance to like win the whole thing. I mean, I think it's currently constructed, they're just too flawed, as I mentioned. I'll go back to some of the Beal on-off stuff I mentioned. They're a minus not 6.9 when he's on the court this year and a plus 4.5. So almost over a 10-point swing when he is out there. When Booker and KD are on the court together without Beal, they're a plus 9.5. And when they're on the court, all three of them, they're a minus 0.7. So, I mean, he just has not gelled with this group. So I think it's pretty clear between that and the other flaws with the lack of defense, the still questions around the center rotation, and the hole they've put themselves in. I mean, they'd be lucky to get up to the 6th seed right now, which it's still in play, but they have a tough schedule coming up. I think they have the toughest remaining schedule in the NBA, someone pointed out.
Wow.
So as currently constructed, I'd be surprised if they won a series. But if you make the Butler deal, I think that I'd feel a lot better about them being able to maybe claw their way up to that 6 or 5 seed. But even then, it's really difficult in today's NBA to make such an overhaul of your roster and the style in which you want to play and the personalities you have in a locker room mid-season and put it all together in just a few months. So there's really not a lot of examples of it. I think really the only example I can think of a time where a team added an all-star caliber player mid-season and went on to win the whole thing was Rasheed Wallace back in 2004. But I also feel like that 2004 Pistons team is the anomaly of all anomalies. Yes. Everything we say is like the only example that doesn't follow for this is the Pistons in 2004.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
And so I just think the lack of continuity, there would obviously be some growing pains trying to integrate him into the lineup. And also just like the trade rumors surrounding everybody right now. Like I find it hard to believe they'd be able to put it together for 4 rounds in the finals or in the playoffs. So back to your question about how many teams I would have above them. I mean, I think Oklahoma City, no brainers in a tier of their own right now. Memphis, I would trust more at this point, even though I still have my doubts about them. If they played in a playoff series today, I've watched the Suns enough to know, like, I just don't think they're beating that team 4 out of 7 times. Houston's interesting. Like, could I see them knocking off Houston? I could see it, but I still don't even know if I'd pick it as currently constructed. But if they add Jimmy, then I think I could be talked into it, and I think they could maybe win a round depending on the matchup. I think Houston is just going to have to take their playoff loss this year before we can take them more seriously. So I'm all transparency. I think I would pick anybody over whoever the Rockets play. I'm probably going to pick the other team. Yeah. So I think I would have them above Houston. And then Denver has played a lot better recently. I think Denver would be ahead of Phoenix still. Dallas, as a threat to win it all, I still think I'd pick Dallas. I think Dallas is risky right now. Obviously, Lively is a huge question mark. He's going to be out for a while. There was Gafford and like trade rumors. I don't know what they're going to do at the deadline, if they're really going to do anything. But Luka still isn't back. We still haven't really heard an update on his timetable. They've struggled a lot since he went down. Kyrie plus the role guys just hasn't really been enough to gain any sort of regular, consistent success. So, but if you are operating under the assumption that Luka's back by playoff time, I mean, even if they're the 8th seed, I'm going to pick them over Phoenix in really any scenario, just because of the experience they've got, and just because Luka is Luka. So just thinking through the Clippers and Lakers get weird because I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with either of them, honestly. I think they're kind of in the same boat as Phoenix. So I wouldn't confidently put them ahead of them. If they make the Butler deal, then I'm kind of like, they're all in the same boat of like, if they got the right matchup, I think they could win a first round series. But I wouldn't be surprised if they got swept first round. You know what I mean? So,
Yep. I think.
What are your thoughts, Seb?
I think we're really aligned here because I think when you're asking the question, like the teams that can actually win it, for that exercise, you kind of have to give teams the benefit of the doubt. Like, okay, let's assume their guys are right. Like, let's assume this is really the best case scenario for the rest of the season, and you're evaluating these teams at their ceiling. That being said, I think there's two teams surefire that stand above them, and that's the Thunder and the Nuggets, in my opinion. Just obviously the Thunder regular season dominance, don't need to explain that too much. In Denver, they've really put it together lately, and having the best player in the world, that's kind of a no-brainer.
I would agree with that.
And then I think, if you asked me last week, I would have said the Mavericks with confidence, but I do think, again, for my listeners that just saw me put the Mavericks as contenders, it's just because, again, Lively has this foot ankle injury and he's going to be out. There's actually mixed reporting out on it, which is kind of weird, but it's going to be at least 2 months. Let's be honest here. And so that could be a more generous timetable. And what does he look like when he comes back? So the Mavs are just so banged up right now, but I'd still probably lean them with their ceiling. But after that, I would say those three teams, and then I have the Suns, because I just think with those two guys, and I know, we haven't even talked about Minnesota, didn't talk about the Lakers or the Clippers ad nauseum here, but I just feel like the championship pedigree of Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, who's played in the final series, I do think, and we know that this team is trying stuff right now. They have clear areas where they can improve, and they're getting aggressive with it, and I think the moves that they've made around the margins the past couple years has been positive. Going back to whatever you wanted to say for that Ayton deal and whatever, everything they've done since that moment, I think has improved the roster. And so I have a little bit of confidence that this team is going to find a way to get more competitive before the trade deadline here.
Yeah. And one last thing I'll just add is it's, there's been a lot of debate with them as well of just the vibes and around the team in terms of specifically Devin Booker, because I feel like if you go back 3-4 years, his reputation was he was getting Kobe comps, the whole killer mentality, do whatever it takes to win. And I think the influence of Chris Paul was positive on him in that front, where Chris Paul's just a basketball psycho, just will do anything on the court to try to gain even just the smallest little advantage to win. But I kind of feel like KD has rubbed off on him a little bit in a negative way, where I love KD. I don't buy the whole he's not a good leader, blah blah blah, whatever. But I do think the way he approaches the game is a little bit different, where he's kind of I just want to hoop. It's just basketball. I just want to play. I love playing basketball, and that's it. And so I feel like Booker has kind of leaned more towards that now, where it's almost not winning's everything. It's more about just I'm just trying to go out there and do my thing. You know what I mean? And so that's almost that's another reason why I think Jimmy would vault them up, is because I think he brings a little bit more of the former of what I mentioned, versus they almost feel a little too relaxed. They don't care about the tough losses they have, which of course they care. I'm not downplaying that. I know they do, but I feel you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it too, and again, I don't watch enough to really come to that realization on my own, but if just keeping in mind what you just said, I think it's just all about the style of basketball that's being played is definitely could be a lot less fun for Devin Booker right now, especially they had a really good, well-rounded team that really complemented the skill set that he had in place when we're talking about that 2021 version of the Suns, where you have Mikal Bridges, you have Cam Johnson, you have Chris Paul, you have an engaged DeAndre Ayton. That's just a completely different group than what the Suns have right now. And it just feels like a lot of your turn, my turn. It seems like a lot of the shots that Devin Booker has to take are ones that are created himself, right? There's a lot less easy looks that he's getting. And maybe that's improved a little bit this year. I defer to you on that with the acquisition of Tyus Jones and things like that, and all the rhetoric last year about how they just needed a point guard and that was magically going to fix everything. Hey, you got a pretty good one, especially for the price that they paid. But you compare that to what it was playing next to Chris Paul in 2021, that's just a very different basketball situation. So that's just kind of my take on that. But I do think that's a fascinating discussion for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I want to kick it over before I let you go here. And again, thank you for the time. It's really, the Suns have been a team that's fascinated me all year long. So I'm really glad we were able to do this. And right before things get even spicier with the Suns, I'm sure. So we'll have to see where they take it from here. But
Mm-hmm.
All-Star stuff, it's coming out soon. We're like 4 days away from the All-Star reserves being announced. We had the starters announced earlier this week. And I'm not going to make you go through the whole roster. I know you did a podcast on that earlier this week. But
Mm-hmm.
give me your most controversial all-star snub, we will say, right? Because my biggest complaint, these rosters are so difficult to make. The league is so deep right now. It's a difficult exercise. And I just want to know, like, if you tweeted out your ballot, like if you had a vote, if I had a vote, whatever, and we tweeted out our ballot, who would be, like, what fans would be in our DMs? Who would be the most pissed about our biggest snub? I wanted to kick it over to you first.
Yeah, it's a difficult question because we were talking before we hopped on here and just saying, like, everybody's always mad someone doesn't make it, but then you got to say who doesn't make it. And so, like,
Yes.
I feel like the guard position in the East is stacked. For example, like, I actually had Darius Garland not making it and Trae Young not making it, even though I think both of them are extremely deserving. But it's like the guard spots ahead of them between Brunson, Mitchell, LaMelo. I think Tyler Herro's having a all-star worthy season, Cade. And so it makes it really difficult. But one that I'll bring up that I know you're probably not too happy about is that I did have Jaylen Brown not making it this year. I thought that his numbers are just down across the board. And I think he's a big part of why they've been more inconsistent recently. I mean, his field goal percentage is the lowest of his entire career this season. His 3-point percentage is the lowest of his entire career this season. So he's just been a career worst efficiency. This is even going back to early in his career as a 19-year-old rookie on a conference finals Boston team back in 2017. I know he's made strides as a passer, a playmaker, and I don't read too much into scoring volume. I know it's down from what it's been in the past, but that's not really important to me because they're a team that's built to kind of share the ball a little bit more. But his advanced stats aren't great either. I mean, he's got a 54% true shooting. I think league average is like 56, 57, 58 at this point. If you look on Basketball Reference, his offensive rating, defensive rating, he's a net zero. He's got a 111 offensive rating, 111 defensive rating. So I felt like if he got in, it would be for no other reason than the Celtics are pretty good and he's been an perennial all-star. You know what I mean? I didn't think he's been playing his best basketball this year. And I also don't think Boston is quite as good. Last year, it's like, well, it doesn't matter. They get two guys. That's how Cleveland is this year. That's how I was operating in the West as well with OKC. I think Jalen Williams, I don't know if he really deserved it over some of the other guys that from an individual standpoint that I didn't have on the team. But they just get two guys. That's kind of where I'm at with that. I don't feel like Boston's quite at that level this year. They're obviously on pace to win 55 plus games and in a really good spot in the standings, but I don't know. That was kind of my thought process, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
You're a very thorough guy, so I'm not surprised you had a lot of thought. It wasn't just like, hey, fuck Jaylen Brown, I'm going to piss Nick off and make all the Celtics fans mad. I knew it wasn't that, so I do appreciate that there was a real argument. I do disagree. I think, it's difficult to separate my bias here. I knew his efficiency was down. I know it to the eye test, it hasn't looked very pretty. But like when you say like lower 3-point percentage than him, like his first year in the NBA, it's like
32% this year.
Yeah, like he's taking a lot more, and that's part of it, right? I think where you lose me a little bit is that we just have to keep in mind, like, we're not comparing Jaylen Brown to previous versions of Jaylen Brown. You know what I mean? We're still comparing Jaylen Brown to everybody else. Like, who is having the best season this year? And I think when you're looking at the front court in the East specifically, I still think he has a leg up over those other guys that are coming off the bench. I have him right there with Mobley and Siakam as my guys. And I think ultimately where you landed on it after listening to your podcast was a guy like Jalen Johnson, who I think has had like a great season for the Hawks and definitely in consideration for me. But I still think that Jalen in that case is a more valuable player. I think he's a more valuable asset. I think we ask him to do a little bit more and create. And I think his value to the Celtics is like, hey, look, all that narrative around the team, like, hey, they're just so 3-point dependent. If the threes aren't falling, are they really this elite team? And more people said that last year before they won the championship than this year. But where Jalen is so advantageous to us is like when we need a bucket in the paint, we need somebody to be aggressive on offense in creating a shot close to the basket or creating a again, contradicts his percentages, like a higher value shot near the rim. Jalen is that guy that can really change the momentum for us. And so again, that is a very homer last take. I will admit that. But with everything else he brings, he's still 23 points per game. He's still a great creator. He's still a great rebounder. That's where I have him there. So I had to push back a little bit, but it's a hard exercise. And I would agree with you, is definitely the name that I think would make the most fans upset for sure.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I had Jalen Johnson. I also had Siakam. I also had Mobley. I think both of them are very deserving. I think Siakam's having a very underrated year this year. People aren't really talking about it, but he's been the best player on Indiana in my opinion.
Yes, 100%.
But I don't know. I will slightly disagree with you on the fact that you say that the Celtics asked Jaylen Brown to do more. Because I think you've got a lot of guys that can create a shot. Yeah. I think you can dump it down to Porzingis in the post or do a pick and pop with him. You've got White and Holiday, both guys. I mean, Holiday's been a multi-time All-Star himself, the second or third option on a championship team. And then you look at the Hawks, and it's like Trae Young is doing a lot for them, obviously, but he's having a weird, inefficient year. He's shooting only 40% on the season, which is why I couldn't quite get there with him. But then who else on that team is like, who's their next best shot creator? Bogdanovich? Like, I'm not a DeAndre Hunter guy myself. I mean, their centers or rim runners. Dyson Daniels has been spectacular defensively, but still leaves a lot to be desired offensively as a shooter and a ball handler and shot creator as well. So I just feel like without Jalen Johnson, the Hawks are Trae Young and a bunch of role players, which we've seen I mean, they did make conference finals, but in recent years has not been a winning formula. And I know that they've stumbled a little bit recently, but the fact that they seem pretty comfortably in the playoffs, I felt like Jalen Johnson his emergence has been the difference between the Hawks of the past couple years being like a 11-10 seed play-in team that you don't take seriously to this year, a team that's beaten Boston twice, that's beaten Cleveland twice, that's beaten New York twice. Like, he's such a prominent factor in that. So that was kind of my tiebreaker there. So.
Totally. No, I think it's valid. I think there's so many different things to consider. Like, my answer to that is just like, hey, the Celtics are still 10 wins better than the Hawks, so you feel a little bit better about getting that second guy in there. But you're right. I think the Celtics, your original point of like, hey, they're not at the threshold where like they just have to have two All-Stars. I think they probably end up deserving it because I still have Jalen in the mix. But it's not a lock like it is for a team like OKC because the record just doesn't support it. So it's fascinating, man. For me, my snubs would probably be like just looking at the name value when I went through and did this exercise. Like, I don't have Ja Morant. Like, I didn't even really consider him. He didn't play in enough games for me. Like, it's kind of tricky because we have this standard for all NBA as 65 games, but for like the All-Star teams, we don't. I like to like in my head be like, you have to play in 30 games because, you know, that's roughly on pace for 65 games. It's like a nice little tiebreaker for me. And I just feel like even though I had nobody from Memphis, which sounds crazy, I think that just speaks to how it's hard. I don't want to tie myself to like, just because the team has been really good, like there needs to be an All-Star. I think that speaks to how good Memphis has been as an organization at like finding guys, and like they win these games with their second unit so often that I'm like, it's kind of fitting that they don't have a guy. You could make the argument for Jaren Jackson. I didn't have James Harden. Those were probably like my two big snubs name wise. So
I wanted Harden to get into, but it's tough to make the numbers work in the West. And I did not have Jaren Jackson in either. I think a lot of people are picking him as the Memphis guy, which I get to an extent because Ja's been a little like underwhelming to a degree, but I just thought like the other front court options in the West, I couldn't fit Jackson in. I mean, to me, KD, LeBron, and Jokic are the starters, obviously, that were announced last week. But then you've got Wemby, Sabonis, Anthony Davis, Jalen Williams, and Şengün. Those were the rest of my front court picks, which there's just not another spot for Jackson. I think Rockets have to have somebody, even though Şengün's kind of having a so-so year compared to last year even. Yeah. But then Sabonis has been ridiculous. I mean, he's leading the NBA in three-point shooting. Like, I'm sorry. Like, every time we ask him to do something more, he kind of does it. So I'm a big Sabonis guy. I think he deserves to get in. AD's been the Lakers' best player. LeBron's going to just get in off legacy, which, I mean, not that he's not deserving, but, you know, that's just how it goes. Wemby's got to be in. And then I mentioned I think the Thunder just have to get two. So that left no spot for Jaren Jackson, which is why I ultimately then went with Ja, because I was like, okay, I feel like I have to get a Grizzly in here. And I felt like I felt less bad snubbing some of the guards in the West this year, just because like Look, I didn't even have my guy Booker in there, and he's like, that's my guy.
That's crazy to me.
No,
I should have started with that before I made you, like, all my listeners get mad at you. I should have been like, Sean really is not trying to be biased with this because he doesn't even have his guy Book in there. So I have Book in there still, but
he's having so this is the biggest thing for Booker. I was doing a little deep dive into so why is his shooting down this year and like what's going on? His mid-range shots are percentage-wise are almost the same as they've been. His three-point shots maybe a little bit down, but are in the same range. He shot 70% at the rim last year, which was, other than Luka, the next best for a high usage guy at his position in the entire league. This year he's down to 59% at the rim, which is kind of much more middle of the pack. I think that was 41st percentile or something like that, so below average for his position. So that right there kind of just says like an 11-point dip shooting at the rim is a pretty significant drop off. So I don't know. I test stats. They're all a little down. He's left a little bit to be desired. And honestly, the fact that they have been in the play-in the whole year, I couldn't justify getting two guys in without being accused of a massive homer, which would have been fair.
Yep, dude, it's really difficult. I think I haven't been doing it for long enough and going through the full exercise to say this is the hardest year ever, but I would believe that if somebody who has been doing this for 25 years.
It's just getting harder and harder every year, honestly.
Yeah, and it's crazy that we have guys like, for me, like, again, I didn't really consider Ja Morant. Like, I didn't have to consider Luka. I didn't have to consider Paulo.
Yeah, I didn't consider
Franz.
Luka either. He just didn't play enough. And same with Franz. I wanted to get Franz. I will say this. If Franz had played enough, I would have had him over Jalen Johnson and over Jaylen Brown. I thought he just was deserving on that front.
I watched him. I don't know if you saw the game last night. He had like 25 in the fourth quarter.
Yeah.
Dude, ridiculous. He was just on an all-time heater. And it was so funny because he like could not shoot from three last year. Like that was like the thing. And it's like he worked on his game and it's insane. I think I would have pushed back less, but it is crazy to say guys like I think Jaylen Brown will ultimately get in. So I
think he'll get in too. I was doing more from the what I would pick if it were me, not what I think will happen. Same. Like I had LeBron as a wild card spot when I knew he was going to be a starter because of course. And I'm a big LeBron guy. I love LeBron, but obviously he's not what he used to be yet. Still spectacular, especially considering the age. So
totally. Well, hey, man, this is a fun exercise. We'll see where this ends up landing, but really appreciate the time, man. This was super informative. And again, I mentioned it at the top of the pod, but let the people know where they can find your content.
Yeah, thanks, man. So as Nick mentioned, my podcast is called The Sean Jones NBA Show. A wise man, that wise man being Bill Simmons, once said to always put your name if you're doing a show in it. So I followed those guidelines there. But yeah, I'm on socials as well for like TikTok, Instagram, X or Twitter at Sean Jones NBA. So check me out there. I also do some supplemental writing, released an annual top 100 players rankings, which I do before the season starts. So kind of in between when one ends and one begins to try to not have the highs and lows of, this guy had a great week this week, but not a great week the next week. So I've done that for 2 years now. I plan on keeping doing that. And I've done some other supplemental work there, but yeah, like I said, Sean Jones NBA Show, check it out.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Sean. And we'll talk to you guys here soon. Be sure to follow at Words with Wallace, wherever you get your podcasts as well. And again, if you like my content, I'm sure you'll love Sean's as well. So be sure to drop him a follow and I'll talk to you guys next week. Peace.